Billionaire collapsed after hearing the shocking secret the black maid angrily said to his mother. "What did you just say?" Eleanor Lexington's voice sliced through the ballroom like a whip. The crowd froze. Crystal glasses stopped midair. Even the orchestra fell silent. Across the polished marble stood Ruth Carter, the aging black maid whose trembling hands still clutched a silver tray slick with spilled champagne. Her eyes burned, not with fear, but with decades of swallowed pain. Daniel Lexington, billionaire CEO of Lexington Global, turned sharply toward her. His tuxedo shimmered under the chandelier, his expression tightening with disbelief. "Ruth, please tell me you didn't just say that." Ruth's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "You heard me, Mr. Daniel. Your mother knows exactly what I'm talking about." Gasps rippled through the glittering guests. Eleanor's manicured fingers clutched her pearls. "You dare accuse me of something in my own house." "I've kept your secret long enough," Ruth said, tears glistening in her eyes. "But I won't die with this lie in my heart." "Enough," Eleanor snapped. "You're fired, effective now." Daniel stepped between them, confusion twisting his face. "Mother, what's going on? What secret?" Eleanor's lips tightened. "She's delusional. She's always been unstable." But Ruth's trembling voice rose over the room, sharper, louder, each word echoing off the marble. "You call me a servant? You call me dirt? I buried your husband with my own hands." The ballroom went dead quiet. Daniel blinked, his face draining of color. The champagne flute slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then his knees buckled. He clutched his chest and collapsed onto the marble with a heavy thud. "Daniel!" Eleanor screamed, dropping beside him. "Somebody call 911. Panic exploded through the crowd. Guests rushed for their phones, gowns sweeping across broken glass. Two paramedics burst through the doors, kneeling beside the fallen billionaire. Ruth stood frozen, the silver tray clattering from her shaking hands. The world around her blurred into noise and flashing lights. She whispered under her breath, "Lord, forgive me." It had to be said. Reporters shoved through the chaos, cameras flashing, capturing the billionaire's unconscious body being lifted onto a stretcher. Eleanor's sobs filled the hall. "My son, please save my son." But even as they carried Daniel out, everyone's eyes stayed fixed on Ruth, the maid who had just unleashed a secret that shattered an empire. No one dared repeat her words. Not yet. 2 hours earlier, the Lexington estate was alive with laughter. The ballroom glittered beneath chandeliers imported from Venice. Reporters, politicians, and tech giants gathered under one roof to honor Thomas Lexington, the visionary who built an empire from steel, finance, and ambition, until a boating accident claimed his life 36 years ago. Daniel Lexington, his only son, stood at the podium, every inch the image of control and success. "Tonight," he declared, raising a glass, "we celebrate my father's legacy, a man whose strength built this city's skyline." Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. But behind the applause, a storm was quietly building. At the far end of the room, Ruth Carter moved like a shadow. Her maid's uniform was crisp, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. For 39 years, she had served this family, watching generations rise, fall, and rebuild on the same blood-stained marble. She had buried the past with her hands, literally, and tonight, for reasons she couldn't explain, her chest ached with dread. Eleanor Lexington, Daniel's mother and matriarch of the empire, floated across the room like she owned the air itself. At 68, she still had the elegance of power, diamonds, poise, and a reputation sharper than glass. She smiled at the cameras, but her eyes flickered toward Ruth with something colder than hatred, fear. From a corner, an elderly gardener whispered to a caterer, the old maid's shaking again. "Something's not right tonight." Ruth tried to steady her hands as she poured champagne, but the tremor wouldn't stop. Her mind replayed a voice she hadn't heard in years, Thomas's voice, echoing through the wine cellar that night. "Promise me, Ruth, if anything happens, don't let the truth die with me." She blinked away tears. "Not tonight," she murmured. "Not yet." But fate had other plans. Eleanor caught sight of her trembling hands and sneered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You've all forgotten what this house cost." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" But Ruth walked away before he could ask again, her hands shaking, her soul heavy with something too old to silence anymore. A pause. Before we continue, if you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss stories like this, real, emotional, powerful. And to our returning viewers, thank you for the love and comments that keep these stories alive. Stay with me till the end of this one, because what Ruth finally reveals will leave you speechless. Now, back to the story. Later that night, as the guests dined and the orchestra swayed into a soft waltz, Ruth stood by the grand window overlooking the city skyline. The laughter behind her faded, replaced by the echo of thunder far off in the distance. Her reflection in the glass looked like a ghost trapped between two worlds, the woman she used to be and the secret that still chained her to the Lexingtons. She whispered to herself, "I should have told him long ago," but she didn't. Not yet. And by midnight, the past would rise again. The rain had started outside, soft at first, just enough to make the city lights blur against the ballroom windows. Inside, the celebration continued, but the energy had changed. Something invisible pulsed beneath the music, something raw and uneasy. At the head table, Daniel Lexington leaned toward his mother, trying to break through the tension. "Mother, you embarrassed her earlier. You didn't have to do that." Eleanor didn't even look up from her glass of wine. "Embarrassed who? The maid? Don't be ridiculous, Daniel. Ruth has survived worse than my words." "Still," Daniel said quietly, "you could have shown her some respect." Eleanor's gaze hardened. "Respect? For a servant who forgets her place? I've given her a roof for 40 years. That's more kindness than she deserves." Across the room, Ruth was refilling glasses, her back straight, her eyes distant. Every word reached her like a whisper under the music. She pretended not to hear, but her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She moved toward Daniel's table. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the champagne bottle. "Would you like a refill, sir?" Daniel smiled politely. "Thank you, Ruth." Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Daniel, you're treating her like a guest. She's the help. We pay her, don't we?" Ruth froze midpool. A single drop of champagne splashed onto the white tablecloth. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "See," she said coldly, shaking again. "I told you, she's too old for this." Several guests chuckled under their breath. The humiliation burned through Ruth's veins like fire. Her lips trembled, but she swallowed her anger, forcing a quiet, "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned to walk away, but Daniel's hand stopped her. "Hey, I'm sorry about that," he said gently. "Don't let it bother you." Ruth met his eyes. For a moment, he saw something in them. Pain, regret, maybe guilt, but it disappeared as she lowered her head. "You're a good man, Mr. Daniel," she said softly. "Just like your father was." Eleanor's fork froze midair. "What did you just say?" Ruth blinked, realizing too late that she'd spoken aloud. "Nothing, ma'am. I was just..." "Just what?" Eleanor's voice sharpened like glass. "Comparing my son to that man who nearly ruined this family? Don't ever mention his name again in this house. Do you understand?" The entire table went quiet. Ruth stood motionless, her throat tight. "Yes, ma'am." Daniel frowned. "Mother, enough. What's going on between you two?" Eleanor forced a brittle smile for the watching guests. "Nothing, dear. Just an old woman who doesn't know when to stop talking." Ruth placed the bottle down gently and walked away. She could feel every pair of eyes following her, every whisper pricking her back like needles. As she stepped into the service corridor, Her composure shattered. She leaned against the wall, breath shaking, her hands clenched into fists. "Not tonight," she whispered. "Not again." But inside the ballroom, Eleanor's cold laughter floated through the air, echoing just like it had the night Thomas Lexington died. And this time, Ruth's silence was cracking. The Lexington estate, 36 years ago. The storm outside had turned vicious. Rain lashed the windows of the old wine cellar, thunder rumbling like an omen. The power flickered, throwing ghostly light across rows of vintage bottles and oak barrels. Ruth Carter was 25 then, strong and hopeful, with eyes that still believed in kindness. She worked the night shift alone, dusting bottles and organizing ledgers, when she heard the door creak open behind her. Working late again, came a warm voice. She turned, and there stood Thomas Lexington, tall, broad-shouldered, still wearing his suit from the office. His tie was loose, his expression weary yet tender. Ruth smiled nervously. "Just making sure your best wines don't collect dust, sir." He chuckled softly. "How many times must I tell you, Ruth? It's Thomas when we're alone." Her cheeks flushed. "Yes, sir, I mean, Thomas." For a moment, silence filled the air, heavy with unspoken feelings. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've been the only honest soul in this house," he whispered. "The only one who sees me as a man, not a fortune." "Don't say that," she murmured. "You have a wife, a son, and a prison made of marble." He interrupted, bitterness in his tone. "Eleanor doesn't love me. She loves my name, my power. But you, Ruth, you've been my light." Her eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't say things like that." But he kissed her hand gently, and the tremor in her heart told her it was already too late. Weeks passed in stolen moments, letters hidden behind cellar shelves, late-night whispers, promises made in candlelight. Then came the bracelet, a simple gold band engraved to R.C. My Light. It was their secret until Eleanor found it. That night, the house erupted in screams. Eleanor stormed into the wine cellar, rain dripping from her hair, fury in her eyes. "Where is she?" she shouted. "Where is that maid?" Thomas tried to calm her. "Eleanor, listen to me. You've disgraced me," she screamed. "You brought her into my bed, my home, my name." "Eleanor, stop. It wasn't what you think." But she wasn't listening. She reached for the nearest thing she could grab, a crystal decanter, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, fragments flying. "Don't you walk away from me," she shrieked. Thomas turned his back, exasperated. "I'm done, Eleanor. I'm leaving. You can have the house, the money, the name, but not my soul." Eleanor's hand trembled as she picked up another decanter. "If I can't have you, no one will." The blow came fast, a single sharp crack. Thomas staggered, eyes wide, then collapsed. The red wine spilled across the floor, mixing with his blood. Ruth, hearing the commotion, rushed in moments later and froze. Eleanor stood over the body, breathless while died. "Help me," she hissed. "Help me, or I'll tell the world you did this." Ruth's voice trembled. No, I didn't." "You think they'll believe you over me?" Eleanor snarled. "You think they'll listen to a black maid? You'll hang before sunrise." Ruth backed into the wall, shaking. "Please, what do you want from me?" Eleanor's eyes gleamed with desperation. "We bury him. Tonight." And under the roar of thunder, the two women, one rich with fear, the other poor with guilt, dug a shallow grave beneath the wine cellar floor. When it was done, Eleanor whispered coldly, "He'll never leave me now." Ruth wiped her tears, staring at the dirt-stained bracelet on his wrist. That night, she promised herself she would never speak of it again. But the dead have a way of whispering through time, and 36 years later, his voice would return to haunt them all. The ballroom pulsed with life again, but something felt different now. The laughter was louder, faker, like everyone was pretending nothing had happened earlier. Eleanor Lexington stood near the stage, surrounded by senators' wives, her diamonds catching every flash of light. She laughed too hard, her drink too full. but she kept glancing at Ruth Carter. Ruth stood by the buffet table, shoulders straight, eyes hollow. Her mind was still trapped in 1987. The sound of thunder, the smell of wet soil, Thomas's voice echoing, "Promise me." She had kept that promise for 36 years. Tonight, it was breaking her. Daniel approached her quietly. "Ruth, are you all right?" She nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir. Just a little tired." "You sure?" His tone softened. "You've been with my family longer than anyone. I don't like seeing you like this." Eleanor's voice cut through the room, sharp as a blade. "Daniel, darling, don't waste sympathy on her. She's had decades of our generosity." Ruth froze. Eleanor raised her glass. "To loyalty," she said loudly, glancing right at Ruth. "Even when it comes from the help." The guests laughed politely. Cameras flashed. Ruth's hand tightened around the tray. The glasses rattled. Eleanor turned to her again. "Oh, Ruth, don't glare at me like that. You look just like you did the night my husband." She stopped herself. Ruth's breathing quickened. "The night your husband—" "What, ma'am?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "The night he died. You remember, don't you?" The words hit like acid. Ruth stepped forward, shaking, her voice rising. "Yes, I remember every second." Gasps echoed as she slammed the tray onto the table. The crystal glasses shattered, wine spilling like blood across the linen. Eleanor flinched. "What is wrong with you?" Ruth's tears streamed freely now. "You've called me every name, treated me like dirt, humiliated me for years, but you don't get to erase what really happened." Daniel stepped closer, his heart racing. "Ruth, stop. What are you talking about?" Eleanor's face paled. "Don't you dare." But Ruth's voice cracked open, raw and trembling. "You call me a servant? You call me dirt? I buried your husband with my own hands." The room fell dead silent. Every breath froze. Every head turned. Daniel blinked, his face white as snow. "What did you just say?" Ruth's voice broke into a sob. "He didn't drown. He didn't vanish. He's buried right beneath your house." "I know, because she made me do it." Eleanor's hand flew to her chest. "You lying witch." Daniel's hand trembled, his champagne glass slipping from his grip. It shattered at his feet as his chest heaved. "No," he whispered, stumbling backward. "No, that's not true." Eleanor tried to grab him, but he shoved her hand away, gasping for air. His face twisted in disbelief, then pain. "Daniel!" Ruth shouted, reaching out. He clutched his chest, eyes rolling back, then collapsed hard onto the marble floor. Screams erupted. Guests scattered, phones flying from hands. "Call 911, someone yelled. Two paramedics, on duty for the event, rushed in as Eleanor fell to her knees beside her son. "My baby, please don't leave me." Ruth stood frozen, her entire body trembling. The words she had buried for decades hung in the air, impossible to take back. And as the medics carried Daniel out, one guest whispered what everyone was thinking, but no one dared to say aloud. What did she mean she buried him? Rain hammered against the Lexington mansion like a reckoning. Police cars lined a long circular driveway, red and blue lights flashing across the marble facade. Inside, silence reigned. The guests were gone, the champagne dried into sticky stains, and the ballroom, once a symbol of power, now felt like a crime scene. Detective Marcus Hale stood near the grand staircase, flipping through his notepad. "So, the maid shouted it in front of everyone?" he asked the attending officer. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "Said she buried Mr. Thomas Lexington with her own hands." Everyone heard it. Hale glanced around the room, eyes narrowing. 36 years missing, presumed drowned, and now this. He turned to Eleanor Lexington, who sat rigid on the sofa, her pearls gone, her eyes sunken but defiant. "Mrs. Lexington, you said your husband's body was lost at sea. Why would your maid claim otherwise?" Eleanor's voice trembled. "Because she's insane. She's old, confused. My husband's death was investigated decades ago. The detective didn't blink, and yet she described a cellar, a grave, A bracelet with an engraving. Her face paled. That bracelet was stolen years ago. Then you won't mind if we take a look downstairs. Eleanor's jaw clenched. There's nothing there. But Detective Hale was already signaling his team. Let's open it up. Ruth sat quietly in the adjoining room, wrists trembling in handcuffs. She looked smaller now, but calmer, like someone who had finally put down a heavy stone. When Hale approached her, his tone softened. You can still change your statement, Miss Carter. If this story isn't true, now's the time. Ruth met his gaze, tears brimming but steady. You'll find him, Detective, under the floor of the old wine cellar. Behind a rack marked 1985 Merlot. You'll see his bracelet too, the one engraved to R.C., my light. Hale's brow furrowed. R.C. Ruth Carter, she whispered. The detective's pen paused midair. You were his. She nodded faintly. I was his light, and his sin. Moments later, the cellar door was forced open. The heavy wood creaked, dust rising like ghosts of the past. The officers descended with flashlights, their boots echoing against the damp stone steps. At the bottom, behind a tattered rug and rusted wine racks, they found it, a patch of uneven concrete, fresh compared to the rest of the floor. One of the men pressed a chisel into the edge. Sir, this section's hollow. Break it open, Hale ordered. The sound of metal striking stone filled the cellar until the slab gave way with a dull crack. A stench of earth and decay poured out. Inside, half buried in the soil, were bones, human bones, still dressed in the remnants of a suit. A corroded gold bracelet clung to the skeleton's wrist. The engraving shimmered under the flashlight beam. To R.C. my light. The detective exhaled slowly. My God. Upstairs, Ruth heard the faint echo of that sentence and began to cry quietly. Tears of grief, not guilt. Eleanor, pale as marble, whispered from the sofa, No, it can't be. It can't. But the truth was out now. The house that once symbolized wealth, class, and perfection had just become a tomb of power, of pride, and of silence. And somewhere between the flash of police cameras and the hum of rain, the name Thomas Lexington began to live again, but this time, not in honor. The Lexington mansion was now swarming with flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. The once pristine marble steps glistened under the rain as two figures were led down in handcuffs. Eleanor Lexington and Ruth Carter. The crowd gasped. Some shouted questions. Others just stared. Is it true you buried your husband, ma'am? Ruth, did she force you? Was the affair real? Neither woman spoke. Ruth's eyes were red, her face streaked with tears, but she looked strangely at peace. Eleanor, however, was shaking with rage, her diamond bracelet clinking like chains. At the precinct, Detective Marcus Hale dropped a worn leather diary on the table between them. Its pages were fragile, stained with age. This was found in your husband's study. Mrs. Lexington, he said quietly. You kept everything neat, except this. Care to explain? Eleanor's jaw tightened. That's private property. Not anymore. He opened it carefully, reading aloud a passage scrawled in fading ink. He says he loves her, the maid. He says she makes him feel alive. I can't let him go. I won't. If he leaves, I'll lose everything. He'll stay forever. Eleanor's eyes widened. Those words, those were just thoughts. I didn't. Mrs. Lexington, Hale interrupted, holding up a second page. We also found a broken decanter, same kind that was missing from your cellar inventory in 1987. His blood is still on it. The color drained from her face. Across the room, Ruth sat silently, her hands folded, listening to every word. You framed me, she said quietly. You made me believe I'd hang if I spoke. Eleanor snapped. You helped me. Don't pretend you were innocent. I was terrified, Ruth whispered. You said they'd never believe a black woman over a Lexington. And you were right. Back then, they wouldn't have. Detective Hale leaned forward. Mrs. Lexington, your fingerprints are on the crystal decanter. You struck your husband. You buried him. You coerced your maid into silence. That's murder and obstruction of justice. Eleanor's composure cracked. Her voice wavered. He was leaving me, for her, for the help, after everything I gave him. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. He loved you once, ma'am. You just forgot what love meant. Eleanor turned on her, snarling. You stole my husband. Ruth shook her head slowly. No, ma'am. You killed him. For a moment, the interrogation room was silent except for the rain tapping the window. Hale rose from his chair. Eleanor Lexington, you are under arrest for manslaughter, coercion, and obstruction of justice. Eleanor's voice cracked. You'll regret this, Marcus. My lawyers. But her words broke into sobs as officers took her away. Ruth remained seated, trembling, whispering a quiet prayer. Detective Hale looked at her gently. Ruth, because you cooperated, the DA's office will recommend leniency. You could have stayed quiet forever. Ruth's gaze was distant. Silence is a prison, detective. I've been serving a life sentence since that night. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 36 years, she breathed without shame. Outside, the city hummed as headlines flashed across every screen. Lexington legacy shattered. Billionaire family exposed in decades-old murder cover-up. And miles away in his hospital bed, Daniel Lexington woke to those same headlines. His empire suddenly built on blood and lies. The steady beep of a heart monitor echoed in the quiet hospital room. Rain streaked the windows, city lights blurring behind them. Daniel Lexington sat upright in bed, pale and hollow-eyed, for lines snaking from his arm. He had survived the heart attack, but his world had not. A nurse turned down the television volume, but not before he caught the words scrolling across the screen. Lexington murder scandal. Matriarch and longtime maid in custody. He shut his eyes. The image of Ruth shouting those words replayed again and again. I buried your husband with my own hands. His father's face, the man he idolized, flashed through his memory, smiling at him from old photos, teaching him to tie a tie, lifting him onto his shoulders. Had all of it been built on a lie? Detective Marcus Hale entered quietly. Mr. Lexington. Daniel looked up, his voice rasping. Tell me it isn't true. Hale hesitated. We found your father's remains. The DNA matches. Cause of death. Blunt force trauma to the skull. It wasn't an accident. Daniel stared blankly ahead. And my mother? She confessed indirectly. Tried to claim it was an accident during an argument. But her fingerprints, her diary, and the maid's statement all align. Daniel's hands clenched the blanket. And Ruth. She cooperated fully. She'll face minor charges, but the DA is recommending leniency. Time served or probation. Silence. The rain's rhythm grew heavier. After a moment, Daniel whispered, I need to see her. In the holding room at the precinct, Ruth sat alone, her hands folded, eyes closed as if in prayer. When the door opened and Daniel entered, she rose slowly. He looked nothing like the powerful billionaire who commanded boardrooms. His tie was gone, his eyes red, his hands trembling. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Daniel said softly, You should have told me. Ruth's lips quivered. I wanted this so many times. But she said she'd ruin me. She said they'd never believe me. And she was right. Back then, no one would have believed a black woman over a Lexington. He shook his head, tears threatening to fall. You lived in silence while my family lived in luxury. I lived in guilt, she replied. Every day, but I couldn't let him rot there forever. Not when the Lord kept waking me in the night with his name. Daniel's voice cracked. You loved him? Ruth nodded slowly. He loved me first, but I never wanted to take him from his family. I only wanted to be seen, to matter. Daniel turned away, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. My father, my mother, you, the people I trusted most. I didn't know any of it. Now you do, Ruth said quietly. The truth may wound, but it also frees. He looked back at her, eyes wet. Freeze who, Ruth? He's gone. She's in jail. And me? My entire empire was built on a corpse and a lie. Ruth's voice softened. Then maybe it's time to rebuild it with truth. Daniel's shoulders sagged. The tears came then, heavy and uncontrollable. He covered his face and sobbed, the sound raw and human, echoing through the cold concrete room. Reporters outside caught a glimpse of him through the glass wall. A broken man whispering through tears. Everything I am came from murder. And for the first time, the world saw not a billionaire, but a son grieving the father he thought he knew, and the truth that would forever redefine him. The Lexington County Courthouse was packed that morning. Reporters filled every row. Cameras lined the back wall, clicking like gunfire as the most powerful family in the city faced its downfall. Ruth Carter sat quietly at the defense table, her prison uniform pressed, her hands folded tightly. She looked frail but peaceful, like someone ready to finally pay the last debt of her soul. Across from her sat Eleanor Lexington, still elegant despite the orange jumpsuit beneath a gray blazer her attorneys insisted she wear for optics. But her eyes, those once commanding eyes, were hollow now. At the prosecution's table, Daniel Lexington sat alone. No tía, no entourage, no lawyers, just a son who had come to see the truth through to the end. The judge, Honorable Miriam Collins, adjusted her glasses and began. The state versus Eleanor Grace Lexington and Ruth and Carter. Her tone was steady, almost gentle, as though she, too, could feel the weight of what 36 years of silence had built. The prosecutor rose. Your Honor, what we've seen here is not simply a crime of passion. It's a crime of pride, privilege, and fear. A man lost his life. A woman lost her soul. And a family lost its legacy. Ruth lowered her eyes as the courtroom fell silent. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she stood shakily, voice trembling. He was leaving me, she said, her voice cracking. After everything I sacrificed, after the empire I helped build, he was leaving me for her. I couldn't bear it. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stay. The judge studied her for a long moment. You buried him. You coerced a terrified young woman to help you. You chose silence for 36 years. Eleanor's face twisted. She could have spoken up, she shouted, pointing at Ruth. She's no saint. She buried him too. The judge's gavel struck sharply. Enough. Then, turning to Ruth, Ms. Carter, do you have anything to say before sentencing? Ruth rose slowly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I won't pretend I'm innocent. I helped hide the truth because I was scared. Scared of the law, scared of her, scared of what people would do to a woman like me in 1987. But the guilt ate me alive. I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day. Daniel looked down, tears stinging his eyes. Judge Collins nodded solemnly. Sometimes truth arrives late, but it arrives. She turned to Eleanor. Eleanor Lexington, you're found guilty of manslaughter, coercion, and obstruction of justice. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Eleanor's face crumpled. No, I'm 70 years old. You can't. Her protest was drowned out by the gavel. Then the judge turned to Ruth. Ruth Carter, you're found guilty of accessory after the fact. Given your cooperation, age, and the circumstances under which this crime occurred, you were sentenced to 3 months in county jail, followed by community service. Gasps filled the courtroom. Ruth's lips trembled as she whispered, Thank you, Your Honor. Eleanor turned on her, fury flashing through her tears. You'll regret betraying me, she screamed as officers restrained her. You ungrateful woman. Ruth met her gaze calmly. I've regretted everything already. As the guards led them both away, Daniel stood, his voice low but resolute. I'll make this right. Somehow, outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded him, microphones flashing. Mr. Lexington, what happens to the company now? Will you step down? Do you forgive your mother? Daniel stopped, looked straight into the cameras, and said quietly, The Lexington name doesn't stand for wealth anymore. It stands for truth. My mother will face justice, and so will I, in my own way." He turned and walked away. No limousine, no bodyguards, just a man stripped of everything but conscience. And for Ruth Carter, sitting in the back of a prison van with her head against the glass, the morning sun looked different. For the first time in decades, it looked like freedom. 3 months later, the morning sun spilled through the iron gates of the Lexington County Jail. Ruth Carter stepped out slowly, a folded paper bag in her hand, the same uniform she'd worn the day she was arrested. Her hair had grown silver gray, her face lined with time, but her eyes carried peace. Waiting by the curb was Daniel Lexington. No press, no cameras, just him, dressed simply in a gray coat, holding a bouquet of white lilies. When Ruth saw him, her steps faltered. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "I had to. You gave me the truth when no one else would." She looked down, tears welling. "It destroyed everything you had." He smiled sadly. "No, Ruth. It freed everything I didn't." He handed her the flowers. "My father's grave. He deserves both our goodbyes." The Lexington cemetery was quiet, blanketed in morning mist. The marble headstone now read, "Thomas Lexington, 1948 to 1987. Beloved father, leader, and man finally found." Ruth knelt beside it, her hand trembling as she placed a single lily on the stone. Daniel stood beside her, head bowed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth whispered, "Truth may sleep, but it never dies." Daniel nodded, voice low, "And neither does grace." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her an envelope. Inside was a single document bearing the Lexington Company seal. She frowned, reading aloud, "The Lexington Carter Foundation." Daniel smiled faintly. "It's official. A nonprofit for victims of abuse and coercion. Funded by everything my family once used to hide their guilt. It's your name now, too. You earned that." Ruth's voice cracked. "I don't deserve that." "Yes, you do," he said softly. "You kept my father's secret, and you gave me back his truth." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're your father's son, after all." He placed a hand over hers. "Maybe now he can finally rest." The wind stirred gently through the trees. The sun rose higher, golden and forgiving, washing the old mansion visible in the distance with light instead of shadow. For the first time, the Lexington name no longer stood for power or money. It stood for redemption. Ruth whispered a prayer, her words carried away by the breeze. Daniel stayed by her side, silent, grateful, and humbled. If this story touched your heart, don't scroll away. Like this video to honor the truth that never dies, and share it so more people can feel its message. Because sometimes stories like this remind us that forgiveness is the greatest kind of justice.